Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of Across the Dinerverse, searching for the heart and soul of America, one diner at a time. How you doing? I'm John Murphy, writer and producer on the CBS Science and Technology series, Innovation Nation with Mo Rocca, which airs Saturday mornings, obviously on CBS. Check the TV guide for airtime in your area. And now, I tour the country talking to people over fancy pants scrambles, which I just had Sunday, by the way, which is pretty good. Steel cut oatmeal, maybe banana cream pie, and I talk about their lives, what they do, and how they feel about the good old USA. The whole point of the podcast is to reveal through casual conversations how much more connected we are than we think, and how much more similar we are than different. But I won't deny that we're a pretty pissed off mass of humanity right now. I mean, we're tearing each other apart over politics, gender issues, education, women's rights, even over the question, what is a woman? Climate change, free speech, whatever, you name it. And I often see on social media throwaway lines like, I want to get off this planet, or I need a vacation from planet Earth. And so I started thinking to myself, how possible is that for us, really? I mean, not just for scientists and astronauts, but for a mechanic or a teacher or everybody in Congress. So I thought I would ask my neighbor across the street, Greg Kazz, who works at the Jet Propulsion Lab in La Canada-Flintridge, California, also known as JPL, what's possible? And even though I've known Greg for years and I know he works at JPL, I'm not really sure exactly what he does. I mean, I don't know if he's a rocket scientist or a rocket engineer or a project manager, so I just call him Rocket Man. That's my neighbor, Rocket Man, Greg the Rocket Man. And so I started looking for a diner to record the podcast, and then Greg invited me up to JPL to meet with him in one of their cafeterias. So Greg, now what cafeteria is this? Because I know you have multiple cafeterias at JPL.
Right. This is the 167 cafeteria, sometimes called the main cafeteria. Yeah, we have 3 of them here.
How's the food here?
It's pretty good, except after COVID, the menu's been kind of narrowed down. Some people are complaining a bit, but in general, the prices are really great. You can get a burger, a cheeseburger for like less than $5.
That's fantastic, because it's all government funded, right?
No, actually it isn't. It's surprising to people that JPL is run by the California Institute of Technology, Caltech. A lot of our work is done for NASA. We have a contract, a 5-year contract that gets renewed.
Wait, you're telling me that every 5 years you kind of go through this, waiting period? Are you going to get picked up again?
Yes. Most of the engineers don't sweat it. But it is a management issue, and we've never missed, and to tell you, also give you some insight, NASA is the preponderance of work at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but that's not the only suitor, so to speak. We also do things for the Department of Energy. Also, there's some military projects being done at JPL, believe it or not.
Really?
Yes.
Wow, I didn't know that. So, but my ultimate question is, since we're here in this cafeteria, I wanted to ask you whether the food was good or not, because I'm thinking about, okay, these are wizards of ingenuity who can put man on the moon and possibly on Mars, but can they make a decent burger?
It's not bad, but the engineers aren't cooking. They're cooking on other things, really, and they're cooking, you're absolutely right, on designs, on implementations, and it's all about robotic spacecraft, remote sensing. So we have really 2 main types of people who work here. They're the rocket scientists. They're the real scientists who study all sorts of things, astronomy, biology, you name it. And they team up with engineers. And so there's really rocket scientists and rocket engineers, if you will. And I'm a rocket engineer.
You're a rocket engineer.
That's right.
I was going to ask you which character from Big Bang Theory you are, but you're not really a scientist. You're an engineer.
That's right. So I take the 5th on that one.
You're not Sheldon, because he's an astrophysicist, right?
Right.
And then Wolowitz is like an astrophysicist.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what the other 2 guys are, but you're just a rocket engineer, which is pretty damn cool.
Yes. And what I love about that show is it brings the public in some way, shape, or form into the vibe of the laboratory of Caltech, and just the fact that they've been talking about Richard Feynman is a wonderful thing, because there's a lot to learn from that man.
Okay, so I had no idea who Richard Feynman was, so I had to look him up. Oh my God. OMG. Now, this guy was really a Big Bang Theory dude. Richard Feynman, spelled Feynman, was an American theoretical physicist known for his work in quantum mechanics, the theory of quantum electrodynamics, the physics of superfluidity of supercooled liquid helium, which sounds like a very hot, sexy read, as well as his work in particle physics. Feynman received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1965, and he assisted in the development of the atomic bomb during World War II. He worked shoulder to shoulder with Oppenheimer, which, okay, you might have an ethical problem with that, but get this. He developed the theory. This is the guy who developed the theory of nanotechnology. I mean, nanoparticles of silver are used to deliver antimicrobial properties in socks. Also, on a side note, when he was applying to universities to begin his scientific career, Feynman was denied entry into Columbia University because they had reached their quota of Jewish admissions. So he said, screw you guys, I'm going to MIT in Boston. And then Feynman landed at Caltech in Pasadena, California in the early 1950s. You've actually met Richard Feynman.
A long, long, long time ago, before he left this earth, there was the Challenger disaster, and he was on the committee, on the Rogers Committee back in '87, and he died in '88. So he gave a talk at JPL just before he checked out of this world, and it was wonderful just to see him, to be in his presence. But,
before we get into all this kind of thing, because the impetus for this podcast is because of the world that we're living in today. People arguing and, fighting or at war. I mean, it's kind of ugly right now, right? Mm-hmm. And you hear people throw this line out all the time. I wish I could get off this planet. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I'm going to talk to my rocket scientist next door neighbor and ask, can we actually get off this planet?
I think some people are trying very desperately, like Elon Musk and company.
So besides being the richest guy on the planet and owning Tesla and Twitter, Elon Musk's first love is absolutely space, and his SpaceX is an American spacecraft manufacturer, launcher, and satellite communications corporation in Hawthorne, California, founded in 2002 by Musk, with the stated goal of reducing space transportation costs to enable the colonization of Mars. SpaceX manufactures the Falcon 9, the Falcon Heavy, and Starship launch vehicles. The largest one ever built launched last Thursday, April 20th, but not all of its engines engaged, and the first stage separation did not go according to plan, so Musk and his team destroyed it in midair. But that's part of the process of pushing the envelope. Other private space companies include Jeff Bezos' Blue Origin and Sir Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic. And that all leads me to the main question for Greg. Will there ever come a day when we can get off this planet anytime we want to?
The vast majority of us at this point in time, and for what I can see in the foreseeable future, no. But what we can do is benefit from remote sensing. So I think that part of our freedom in these troubled times is to look out, right? Look outward and see what can we see outside of the Earth to really kind of turn us on, right? Even though we might not personally be able to experience it with boots on the ground, right, on a planet's surface.
Right.
We'll have the proxies. We'll have the astronauts that do that at Mars. That will eventually happen. I was so happy, and I was so enthralled to think back when I was a kid, when I saw the moon landings, right, in '69, that, my gosh, by the time I'm 40, they'll be on Mars, right?
Right.
There was a pathway, but there wasn't a will.
I was going to ask you, what was your spark to get into this world, into this profession? It was, in fact, Neil Armstrong walking on the moon in July of 1969.
It was more corny than that. It was actually my father bought me a telescope, And we were looking at the sky, and I saw this sort of disky reddish color with my naked eye, because you can see Mars, right, with your naked eye, if you know what it is. And sure enough, he said, yeah, that's Mars. And it's like, blew me away. You mean you can actually see a planet, and you can see a planet with your naked eye, and then you can see it a little bit better with a telescope? It blew me away. And then I got into it. I started getting interested. I cut newspaper articles out when the Mariner 4 went to Mars. It's like, whoa. And then I was feeling very depressed because the pictures that came back from that first mission that orbited Mars, the craters, it was like the moon. They said, Mars is dead. The big 72 font on the newspapers at that time, Chicago Tribune, Mars is dead. And it's like, oh gosh, that crushes me, right?
Right.
And the funny thing of it is, when I think back about that, and the fact that I've been working at JPL for 37 years now, and I'm an early career hire, I'm not, I'm not. There's people who are working over 50 years. Anyway, the thing that really enthralls me is I was able to work with the pioneers during my stay, and I'm still at JPL. I've worked with some of the pioneers that put those spacecraft into orbit at Mars, and I've been able to collaborate with these folks, and that's mind-blowing. The careers of some of these people have been, pretty long, but they've also pretty impressive, of what they've been able to do over time, and so that's really amazing.
I had a shared experience in the fact that when I remember as a kid watching Neil Armstrong take that first step on the moon and then running outside and looking up in the sky and seeing the moon live as we see it every night in the sky, then running back in and watching it on TV and running back out and looking at the moon. And my mind was just trying to put it together. It's like, there's a frickin' guy up there right now. And I got just so excited about it. And then, of course, this is in the 1960s, so Star Trek is a big thing, and all that kind of thing. And I thought, oh, I want to do that. But I didn't have the math chops. I didn't have the brain to do that. This is all I'm good for, is just talking to people.
That's a great talent.
That's all I can do.
But
I wanted to ask you, so what was your journey to get to where you are today?
I started getting into science. I started getting into mathematics. I graduated from the University of Arizona, math, computer science.
Not Arizona State, the party school, but the more legitimate school, Arizona.
It's, yes, the U of A. But they're both wonderful schools, kidding aside. They really are. And so I was looking, what can I do? It was the Reagan time. It was around mid-'80s, 84-ish or so. And there were a lot of buildup of the military at that time. There was a lot of defense contracting work going on. This is the time of the MX missile, missile experimental, missile on railroad cars, moving them around, if you recall, so that we wouldn't get pulverized. And that never did come to fruition. But the big aerospace corporations were building the missile. They were building the inertial guidance control system, the EMUs for those missiles. I started working there at these type of companies. And I wasn't too happy because I really thought, maybe my calling isn't defense. There's nothing wrong with defense. There really isn't. We have to protect ourselves, right?
Of course.
There's a fine line between, you have to decide what you personally want to do. Do you want to be part of that? Nothing wrong with it. Or do you want to be part of something else?
So you don't want to be involved in a technology that destroys things or kills people. You want to be involved with a technology development that pushes us forward, takes humans to other places.
That was my conviction. That's right. But remember that anything that's good can also be used as evil to some extent too. And some of the things we do, we have to be careful from a security point of view because they could be potentially used in a nasty way by our adversaries, and that's where security comes in, right? Cybersecurity, how you treat documents, all these things are important.
Oh yeah, obviously documents, very critical, very important, especially if in the digital age that we're working in right now.
Right. So NASA and the U.S. government is doing a much better job doing a credible job in educating us and other folks to make sure that we do the right thing.
So what do you do specifically, and what projects have you worked on that people might recognize?
Well, I'm a systems engineer, and specifically I'm an end-to-end information systems engineer. So what the heck is that?
Yeah, well, what is that?
It's all about the information. So information systems, end-to-end. So think about a system of systems. So you have information system on the spacecraft. You got a computer. You've got a data handling system on the spacecraft. You have a telecom system. And all that data has to flow into and out of those subsystems on the spacecraft. Also, you've got a ground system. You know, you have JPL, but you have other ground systems for NASA that support receiving and transmitting that data to and from the spacecraft. So the Deep Space Network, for example, if you haven't heard of it, it's the network that supports our NASA missions at Canberra, Australia, Goldstone, California, not too far from here, on the way to Las Vegas. Watch out. And third but not forgotten is Madrid, Spain, Robledo, Spain, to be specific. So they're situated 120 degrees around the globe because you want coverage. You want coverage. Yeah. Now, we don't get coverage of our spacecraft all the time. We don't need to. In fact, it wouldn't really help you that much. That's kind of something people in general don't know. They think we have ubiquitous contact like we do in the internet, right? But we don't. And we don't need to. So we have contact periods when we'll, send commands to the spacecraft. We have times when we'll receive telemetry. In fact, there's a very nice artistic demonstration of that in our Building 180 in the administration building. So I've got to do a plug.
Please
John,
do.
I got to do a plug.
Do.
I welcome everybody to come to the JPL and take a tour. And that's really the best thing to do, because then you will see these things at JPL. You will see things that occasionally you'll see at an open house, which is great. That's another way, but it's open. Go on the website, take a look, and get involved. Go take a tour, and you will be very pleased to have done so.
When you talk about telemetry, what is that specifically?
Data from afar. That's basically what telemetry is. So it's basically what the spacecraft collects, of which there are basically two types. Engineering telemetry, so it's the health and welfare data from the spacecraft. So we know how the spacecraft itself is behaving and what the state of the spacecraft is. And then science, typically science data also that we need. The scientists, the rocket scientists need to understand what their observations are so that they can make these great discoveries.
What have you had to create and develop and engineer that's been problematic, huge things that you had to break through to make something work?
There's different classes of that. One class of that is just getting the mission to the target body. Sometimes things don't work out as well as you hope they do. Sometimes things fail. Of course, we engineer that into the system, right? If something doesn't work, the spacecraft safes itself. We say safe mode, or there's different types of safe modes, but in general, generically, it's a safe mode. So what does that mean? It's kind of like what you do when you're in the mountains and you're in trouble and you can't get back, and so you take precautions. You conserve your body energy, right? You may send up a flare or something, or some sort of mechanism to tell them, hey, I'm in trouble, or SOS you do with rocks or something, so the helicopter can see it. Well, the spacecraft does the same thing. It conserves itself. It tries to point to the sun articulate its solar panels, so it's getting energy, right? And it also slows itself down in terms of activity on board. It doesn't want to do a lot of activities to burn down what little power it has left, right? And then it sends, basically, if it can, it will send messages to the Earth, or it will be in an orientation through which the Earth can contact it, right? And that's the part where autonomy can only go so far.
And that's where the scientists step in and try to take control of it.
The engineers will then attempt to determine from the telemetry that whatever it can get back, there's that word again, telemetry, data from afar, so that they know, the spacecraft team basically understands what's coming. Now, it's It's also possible, and it's happened not just to JPL missions, but also to APL, Applied Physics Lab in Maryland, and others, where the spacecraft goes silent. My gosh, what are you going to do? You try to send commands, it doesn't respond to the commands.
Like a teenager.
Yes. Yes. And so you're kind of, scratching your head, getting worried a little bit. And so people start to think about, well, what could the problem be? And it's interesting because sometimes we lose spacecraft. Sometimes bad things happen, like Mars Observer. That was the first spacecraft I worked on. That was the Mars Observer in 1992, 93 time period, where we went into Mars orbit because it was an orbiter, was going to go around Mars. And it was a very expensive spacecraft. I think it was close to $1 billion, a $1 billion spacecraft. Not something you want to lose, especially in 1993 dollars. So long short of it is, with these spacecraft, you want to have the ability to do all you can to try to bring it back to life, to try to communicate with it. Mars Observer was an ill-fated mission because it was based upon an Earth-orbiting platform, an Earth-orbiting framework that it utilized. And people had concerns during the design phase. The JPL people raised their hands and said, wait a minute, can you send an Earth orbiter-based bus to Mars when we know that we might very well have problems with freezing of the bipropellant that goes through the plumbing, basically, in order to fire up the big engine when you do the massive burn so you can get captured into Mars orbit? And sure enough, that was the problem.
Because how cold is it in space?
Tremendously cold, hundreds of degrees Fahrenheit cold, because you're almost in a vacuum.
Yeah, so 100 degrees below zero in Fahrenheit.
Yes.
Oh my gosh. The engineering didn't work out.
It didn't work out. They tried to convince, it was General Electric at the time that tried to convince the folks that this would work. And
in the 90s, by the way, GE, the same company that owned NBC and was more concerned about the Seinfeld show getting #1 ratings on Thursday nights and not necessarily $1 billion spacecraft surrounding Mars.
Yeah. We learn from these things, and the greatest thing we learned, John, from this whole episode was the fact that we never heard back from the spacecraft. And in fact, before they pressurized the tanks for the burn, and that's where the problem probably occurred. There was a breach in the propulsion system because of the plumbing couldn't take the pressure. But the bottom line for this whole thing was we learned something. And what we learned was we should have spent an extra $1 million to qual the TWIDA, the traveling wave tube amplifier on the spacecraft. They didn't want to do it for $1 million. Yeah, it's a lot of money. Had they done it, we would have at least gotten the telemetry back from the spacecraft to the point where the actual breach in the propulsion system happened.
So you would have known something was going to happen.
You would have known more. Yes, and then you can, but that didn't happen. So from that point on, in 1993, JPL and NASA decreed we shall always, on all our spacecraft, we're going to have telemetry up to the femtosecond we can coming back, right?
What kind of second did you just say?
Femtosecond.
A femtosecond?
Yeah, 10 to the minus 12th.
10 to the minus 12th?
Yeah, it's just a little joke. All I'm trying to say is you don't want to, be... what do they say?
You can't play it safe.
Can't be too cheap. Be too cheap, right? Penny wise and pound foolish in this game is not a wise thing to do.
I mean, $1 million on top of $1 billion, what is that? It's nothing.
But everybody wants to save money, right?
Wow.
Everybody wants to save money. And also from an engineering point of view, it's a risk-reward thing, just like in financing, just like in anything you do, right? How much risk am I really incurring for how much pay do I have to put out for it? And they believed at that time they just couldn't convince the people with the purse that, that should have been done. That should have been paid. So we would have had more insight. So from that point, everybody woke up and said, yes, yea, verily, we will have telemetry as far as we can. We will do the extra step, right? And even in these later Mars missions, you have the ability to to get that extra telemetry that you need just to make sure that these things, that we have a way to know, hey, did it really work? At what point did it fail? It gives us more insight into that. That's awesome. That's huge. That's a big lessons learned.
When you're trying to send spacecraft to fly by Jupiter and out into deep space, and then to not only orbit around Mars, but to physically land on Mars, then to kind of open up the panels, and then this rover comes out, then to control the rover. Then you have a helicopter called the Ingenuity, which is flying around in Martian airspace,
right,
also taking measurements and stuff. How often is there failure that people don't know about? My perception is JPL and NASA rarely make a mistake. There's just perfection. It happens. You guys do it. Houston, we've got a problem. Not on my watch. We're going to get these guys down on Apollo 13. You guys did it. So, but how often is there real crises behind the scenes where stuff is just not going the way you planned it?
When you lose the whole spacecraft, it's hard to cover it up.
What happens to the spacecraft? What happened to the observer? Did it just plummet into the Martian atmosphere and burn up or whatever?
Most likely there was a breach in that propulsion system that I talked about when they tried to pressurize the propulsion tank for the Mars orbit insertion burn. Most likely that's when the problem happened, and it blew apart, and it's now orbiting the solar system.
That's space junk.
Space junk, because it never had a chance to get into Mars orbit, so it's just orbiting it's orbiting it's just orbiting the sun, because it has no other choice. Yeah.
Let me backtrack for 1 second here. Step back in time. So I'm holding up my iPhone 13 Pro. I haven't upgraded to the 14 yet. I want to save the money. But I have an iPhone 13 Pro, which is 10 to 20,000 times more powerful than the computer that landed man on the moon. How do they even do that with a computer that had only like a couple of, 100 kilobytes of computing power?
Right. They were very, very economical. They were very, very good at squeezing every bit of compute power and every bit of data that came back, every decibel. For deep space, you're very, very efficient. You have to be.
JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, was founded way back on Halloween Day in 1936 by numerous Caltech researchers. The laboratory's primary function is the construction and operation of planetary robotic spacecraft, though it also conducts Earth orbit and astronomy missions, and is responsible for operating the NASA Deep Space Network. JPL has more than 6,000 employees, and Caltech alumni have won a total of 47 Nobel Prizes. And I'll ask Greg a little later on what it takes to work at JPL. Let's go to the JPL tote board. So the Mars Perseverance has been on Mars for 2 years, 2 months, and 1 day. And the asteroid watch, this is fascinating to me. The asteroid watch, where you monitor the nearest asteroids, the big asteroids that could wipe out the planet. The closest one, the next closest one is today. And it's 212,000 miles away, which is closer than the moon is. Because the moon is 238,900 miles, something like that.
It varies,
yeah. And but this asteroid, this deadly killer asteroid, is only 212,000 miles away. Now, I love the fact that you have an asteroid watch.
Yes, and we have people here. Mr. Yeomans, don't know if he's still here. He may have retired recently, but he was like Mr. Asteroid. His whole life centered upon doing the mathematics associated with categorizing and cataloging these asteroid.
But is that a real big concern, or is it just kind of for fun and kind of put it out there?
I think it's very real. We have this new mission that's coming down the pike. It's called NEOS, N-E-O-S. At least that's the current name, Near Earth Asteroid Surveyor. That's being worked on. Yes, so that's Ball Aerospace is the contractor for that spacecraft. So.
Also, according to the JPL tote board here, you've got 40 active missions going on.
Yes.
That's a lot.
That's huge, right. So when I started, we talked about, what did I encounter? There were the big flagship missions, right? Mars Observer was a big mission too. Voyager was huge, Galileo. There were these big, and then faster, better, cheaper era came in with NASA around the 1990s with Mars Pathfinder was one of the first ones. And Mars Pathfinder I was the end-to-end information system engineer on that mission. That's the one that people kind of go gaga over because it was the first rover that we landed on Mars.
Mm-hmm.
It was a small Sojourner rover, something maybe a small kitchen table size.
But I remember it's like you're seeing the first images ever from the surface of the planet Mars.
Yeah, it was
from the ground level perspective.
Yes, from the ground level perspective, and it went into the rock garden and did its thing there in the traverses and all that. Of course, now we can traverse a lot further, and our abilities are much more advanced. But I will tell you, back at that time, 1997, we landed on the 4th of July, 1997, being in the control room with the engineers, with people I can still picture, was one fantastic experience. Because can you imagine all the built-up anxiety, all the built-up work, all the camaraderie, all of this? It's like a team. It's very much like a team, but a team that's working for years to hope and help and work together in this great enterprise to try to make this happen. And when it landed, everybody went berserk.
Of course.
Everybody went berserk.
You deserve to do it.
Yeah.
The first time anything had been placed on the planet Mars by a human being from the planet Earth.
But again, the message is exactly that. It's the science, it's the engineering, so that people can get turned on by science, turned on by engineering, because that's really what we're selling.
I totally geeked out prepping for this show. I totally geeked out going on the JPL website and the NASA website and looking at the photos. And the fact that it's owned by the public, I think, is a beautiful thing. And people, when they get all frustrated with Twitter and, all the stuff on Instagram, and, it just drives everybody batshit crazy.
Yeah.
They should go on to NASA or the International Space Station and just look at our planet from space in real live time, and you just kind of take a breath and go, we're going to be okay, I think.
Mm-hmm. Take a breath and see what it does for your psyche. And
I calm down when I see the planet from space. It makes me feel good. It gives me hope. I don't know why. I can't explain it. It's just a visceral feeling. And for me, maybe it's a spiritual thing, And I know everybody reacts to things differently. But when I see the planet Earth from space, there's a magical spiritual quality that comes over me that I feel like this is a beautiful thing that's okay. It's kind of chaos on the ground, but when you take the macro view, look at it from far away, it looks okay. The blue marble looks pretty good.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, and the more you interrogate it by the use of science and think about it from an engineering sense, it only adds to the beauty that you see visibly. It only adds. And that, sometimes people think artistic, science, they're totally orthogonal to each other. A scientist or an engineer that looks at something artistically, well, what has that person got to add? They're just going to tear it apart, right? They're going to criticize and all. No, I don't think so. I think it's just the opposite. I think the scientist and engineer provides a different view to enjoy and to understand and try to take it a little bit in a different direction, right? Not to negate it, but to only add to it. And I think that's important.
So I'm assuming you worked on the Mars Perseverance.
Not directly, but I had people who did work on it. I worked on Mars Pathfinder. As I said, I was the end-to-end information system engineer on Pathfinder. I worked on Mars Observer too. And then I started getting into standards. So I got into what we call the underwriters, what is to electrical, cables and all that, is to data is CCSDS, Consultative Committee for Space Data Systems.
That sounds boring.
Okay, how about cruising to sunny and distant shores?
Okay.
That's much more entertaining. So why did I say that? Because it's all about the data systems, right? We're trying to internationally standardize how we send commands to our spacecraft, how we send telemetry, how we get telemetry back from the spacecraft, how we do ranging, how we do radiometric data. That's basically the data the navigators need in order to understand where the spacecraft's going to, and about mission operations, that you can actually standardize procedures about how we do these things internationally, not just NASA, but ESA, European Space Agency, ASI, the Italian Space Agency, the Germans, DLR. There's about 11, 12 major players, space agencies, and about 31 different affiliates, nations that don't quite have a space agencies, but they want to participate in standardization as well.
Do you feel like there could be a big battle for space and control of space?
Militarily, perhaps, but that's not the playground I play in.
All right, yeah. But I mean, it seems like it's such a wide open frontier. It seems like the first one who's going to get there is going to try and control it.
Well, there's a treaty. There's a treaty that was written, right, where, for example, the moon, right, back in 1958 or so, right, that the moon would be a place where we wouldn't do war and we would peacefully explore it. Right, so I know many nations signed on to that. So hopefully,
did China sign on to that?
I hope so.
Yeah,
but you're right. There's competition. There's competition in terms of vendors, in terms of companies that want to, the Lockheed Martins, the Raytheons. They're competing in terms of, hey, I want to sell you a solid state recorder. I want to sell you computer chips and parts and things like that are rad hardened, radiation hardened, and things like that. So there is competition for that, and we want to make sure, getting back to that CCSDS thing again, that they use standards in doing it. So they're interoperable, the big word, interoperability. So, hey, look, I've got a rover on Mars, I've got a NASA rover, but there's an ESA orbiter. I sure would wish and hope that they could interoperate. I could take the telemetry coming from that NASA rover, bring it up to that ESA orbiter, and then send it back to a Japanese ground station, and it all works. It's kind of like the Sandra Bullock thing that she did. She's coming back down to Earth. And
in the movie Gravity?
Yes. And they were talking about manned, people flight, how all these systems interoperate, which the manned, no, they don't quite interoperate like she did it. But for our robotic spacecraft, that's more of a good analogy.
What's your take on the outside entrepreneurial world? Virgin, Elon Musk, going into space and doing all these things, Elon Musk being able to re-land a rocket ship back on the planet and reuse it again, which seems pretty freaking amazing to me. How cool is that? And what's the perception within JPL of these outside inventors and investments?
I think the perception is positive up to a point, because part of it is you don't want to exaggerate your capability. You want to be honest of what you can and can't do. You want to be honest in terms of what you don't need to do. If you have a network, like the Deep Space Network, for example, that we utilize, it's an extremely expensive asset, right, to put these antenna farms out in these places where nobody can go. Well, it's hard to get to, right, because of interference. You don't want a lot of radio interference out there.
So wait a second.
You don't want all these companies duplicating things we already have.
Wait a second. So when you talk about a deep space network, you're literally talking about towers, quote unquote towers, so to speak.
Radio telescopes
that constantly feed telemetry back to you. You have these communication satellites deep in space communicating.
Right, and they're not 24/7, right? They're opportunistic. They're driven by their needs. So yeah, they're basically setting up view periods. They're looking into the future. They're 30 days schedules, and they're basically supporting not just NASA missions, but also, like I said, these international missions because of the standards, because they subscribe to these CCSDS standards.
Does the Elon Musk rockets or the Virgin rockets and stuff like that, do they get to utilize that?
They could utilize them. Yeah, they could. I don't know. They may be using commercial providers. But it's very expensive to build an infrastructure like that, right? So, I mean, in our moon missions, the new moon missions like Viper, the rover that's going to the moon, right? All of these are supported by the Deep Space Network.
Why is it so hard to get back to the moon when we went to the moon the Apollo mission, 6 or 7 times?
Something like that, yeah.
With computers that were less powerful than the phone I'm holding in my hand.
Right.
Why is it so hard to get back to the moon?
I think it's two things, money and will. We're going to land a woman on the moon, and why do you think that's happening? Chinese. It's the space race 2.0, right?
Yeah.
Because they're so aggressive and assertive.
And what's our mission there once we get to the moon?
Well, build a permanent base, right? We want to have a permanent And I think that's wonderful because we can do experiments at the moon. We could learn more. It is a building block to go on to Mars.
Would you say the International Space Station and like the year some astronauts have spent in space was kind of the precursor to putting somebody on the moon for a year?
In part, I think it's a stepping stone, also an experimental platform, right, where you can do microgravity experiments. We have an operational presence on the space station doing the internet in space. Now, that's a whole different branch of things to talk about. But get this, it's interesting. It's not like the internet, because the internet, you're always connected, right? 24/7 connectivity. Deep space, just space, you don't have that connectivity. You don't have it, so it's a different paradigm. Plus, you have these tremendous one-way light times. When we were talking about, hey, Mars, sometimes it's a half hour, sometimes it's 2.5 hours, depending upon the orbit of Mars with respect to where you are at the Earth. Oh, hey, how can I hold on to that? Well, I can't, get a connection and then wait that long. That's nuts. That's absolutely nuts. Well, wait a minute. Delay-tolerant networking. It's actually a standard. It's a CCSDS standard. It's being worked for the military because they have these situations where, hey, I can't get to a battlefield person at a time. I need to be able to do something different in order to cache the data and provide it to somebody else later. I have to be tolerant of delay. A whole different thing, a whole different way of communicating, a whole different set of standards. This is the way in the future that we find that we'll be networking in space.
Will you be able to order something from Amazon in space?
Yeah, you got to be delay tolerant. You can order it. You just, it's going to be, that pizza is going to be really cold by the time you get it. Or the picture of the pizza.
I just wanted to talk to you real quickly about, I know you just mentioned that you haven't worked directly with Perseverance, the newest rover that's on the planet right now, with its accompanying helicopter, the Ingenuity. Got sounds for the first time ever from the Martian atmosphere. I mean, take a listen to this. I mean, it sounds so otherworldly. And then here's a sound of the actual rover moving over the Martian surface. So it's going over rocks and it's going over the sand and all that kind of. Mm-hmm. And to hear that this sound that is actually from Mars on the planet is just blows my mind. It sounds amazing. Mm-hmm. How difficult is it to capture the sound? Because the atmosphere is thinner there. Mm-hmm. So the sound doesn't travel as well, right? And then you have Martian winds. Mm-hmm. How strong are the Martian winds?
They could be terribly strong. I mean, you get these outages where the whole planet can be engulfed in dust storms, too. And it builds up over time. So if you have solar panels, like on Pathfinder, eventually that's the thing that killed the mission. But we knew, all our missions tend to last longer than what we originally estimate, right? But those are things that, degrade the feasibility.
But how do you capture that sound? What kind of special process do they do to get the sound?
So the whole aspect of, this idea about telemetry, getting data from afar, a lot of folks have a misconception, I would say, of what's really happening, right? And I'll say it this way. So, propagation delays are very, very far for these deep space missions. We talked about Mars. Mars isn't that far away compared to Jupiter, some of the outer bodies, right? And yet it's taking hours to get it. So the propagation delay, that's a 1/r² problem, right? Just like gravity. And so basically we've got an extremely weak signal by the time it hits our nice big dish antennas at the Deep Space Network, right? Where we're talking 34-meter high efficiency antennas. But the bottom line is when you get this extremely weak signal, and I'm talking something like Saturn or Neptune, something like 10 to the minus 36 watts. I mean,
is that even anything?
It's like of some gnats.
10 to the minus 36 watts.
Right.
Watt.
So, okay, so wow. then you guys must amplify that. So you must have like these super ass-kicking amplifiers at these stations to bring that signal up, right? Not at all. The mind-blowing part of this thing is that it's not the signal we amplify, it's the noise floor that we lower. The cooling process is the key. These receivers are cooled to around 10 Kelvin, and where 0 Kelvin is, you don't have any molecular action anymore, right? Atoms still move, but molecules don't. in a sense, what's happening is it isn't the signal, that little tiny 10 to the minus 36 watt that's getting amplified, just the opposite. It's the noise that's getting lowered down, reduced to almost, barely nothing. So that little tiny thing pokes out like a big lollipop. Do your processing and eventually get to the digital bits, the ones and zeros that represents the science and engineering data that we want to see.
And then you can extrapolate from that and actually get real data.
That's the magic. And that magic occurred like in the late 50s, cooperation with Spain and Australia. I mean, making all this work, it wasn't a given. It was a big risk. It was a big enterprise. And it came together, and it's still working today.
Space, the final frontier. I love that line. It is the final frontier. You have telescopes. You said you were brought into the magic of space and science through the telescopes and being able to, the wow factor of being able to see with your naked eye through a telescope Mars. I know you have a telescope that once in a while you bring out in the neighborhood when there's a nice celestial event of some kind. And I've seen through your telescope, the rings of Saturn, which it just blows me away. It's just so crazy. And you can see the red spot on Jupiter, and it's just amazing. Mm-hmm. Hubble telescope versus this new Webb telescope. What's the mission of the Webb telescope, and what is it exploring, and what are we getting back from it? What are we learning about space, how old it is, or how far it goes? Is the universe really expanding?
Right. So it's a matter of wavelength, really. That's what it comes down to. Hubble was visible, and Webb is infrared. So we want to look at a different part of the spectrum. We can't see the infrared. There's some snakes apparently that can see in the infrared. And yes, we are looking back as far as we can go. We want to keep on looking back to see when did the spark of the universe occur? Is it really 13 billion years ago? Is it further than that? What's going on? Where did all this come from?
What's been discovered so far? What's the big wow moment of the Webb telescope right now?
Well, I've been looking at some of it, just the fantastic pictures that they're showing today, and the birthing of galaxies, and I haven't had a chance to really catch up on all of it, but I think that's the fantastic part, is the new birthing, the going back even further.
So therefore, the universe is expanding. If new galaxies are being birthed, then the universe is expanding.
There's theories. There's different theories about, there was at one time a steady state where they thought it was going back and forth, which doesn't seem to be the case at all. They're just theories because we don't really know for sure, but most likely. One interpretation of all of this is no matter what happens, it's just going to happen. You can't change it. It's not like things are as rosy as we think in terms of, everything's going away basically, right? The moon is moving away from the Earth, because of tidal forces of the Earth, and eventually there'll be a point where the moon actually comes back, and then the gravity of the Earth will crush the moon, and then we'll have rings around the Earth. Billions of years from now, nobody's going to worry about it in this broadcast. But the fact that, this idea of permanence, it really gives you an appreciation for what the heck does it mean for permanence. And my take on it is, live life to the fullest, obviously, and it's in all our interactions that we do, in and by itself has meaning, just by the fact that we're sharing it all together.
Yeah. I'm assuming JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which has 40-plus missions going on right now, part of those missions are observing our Earth, monitoring things on our planet.
Yes.
Climate change on our planet. Mm-hmm. Right. So my question is, how much of the climate change, because you talked about permanence just now, how much of this climate change discussion is all man-made, or is it part man-made in the natural cycle of the planet? I mean, we've had multiple ice ages. Thousands of species have been eradicated with these changes in the planet over the millions of years. Is it part man-made and then part of a natural, maybe, cycle change of the planet?
There's no denying the impact that mankind has on the climate.
Sure. Absolutely,
no question. Yes, there's contributions from nature, too. There's no question about that, too. But, I mean, all the data, and Greta Thunberg, the Swedish advocate, the young girl who's becoming more and more of a woman every day, she has a wonderful book out about that, too. that's out there. That's a good book to read. It's somewhat depressing, but it does have a lot of data in it, because basically the basic answer is, well, we really need to start waking up and changing the way we live. Yeah.
And if we don't, then we have to get back to the original start of this whole podcast. Can we get off the planet? And what is the barrier to humanity getting off of Earth and living in space somewhere else?
Yeah, the biggest barrier is the physics, too. The tremendous amount of energy it takes to leave Earth orbit. So, what do? That's a tough one to solve.
And then there's the radiation factor, right?
That's right. Yeah, as the folks who have been living on the International Space Station, right, and the Russians too, and the American, I think it was the senator from Arizona, right?
The junior senator from Arizona, who was also a Navy pilot and an astronaut, is Mark Kelly, who spent a total of 50 days in space, traveled 20 million miles, and commanded the Space Shuttle Endeavour on its final flight. But his twin brother, Scott, is the real long hauler, having spent a total of 520 days in space, 340 of them consecutively aboard the International Space Station. But, hold on to your hats, the all-time record holder is a female astronaut, Peggy Whitson, who has a whopping 665 days in space. What the? Really? 665? It's like almost 2 years. Wow, you go, girl.
Boy, I tell you, you get weight loss, you get higher potential for cancer. All of these things are not trivial. They're major factors.
And what do you think the barrier is to getting man to Mars?
Again, the radiation is a big thing, right? Building, and they're working on it. The manned programs are working on it, building an environment through which when they do transit to Mars, they're mitigating the radiation effect. That's a big deal. Mm-hmm. Also, hey, being away from your family, being away from your friends.
Doesn't it take like 9 months just to get there?
The trajectories that we've used for deep space, for our satellites, we use a Hohmann transfer. Technical term, Hohmann transfer is the way to get to planets, and there's a 7-month and there's a 11-month one. So to minimize the amount of energy that you're going to use in order to get to the planet, basically from Mars, it's 7 or 11 months south.
Will the private space agencies get to Mars before NASA and JPL or the European Space Agency will?
Boy, Elon's really trying, right? He's really trying to get to Mars. I can't foresee that per se. If they do, they're going to take on a lot more risk, I would think, than what NASA would be willing to take on.
So lives would be lost in trying to get there.
Potentially, yeah. But there were a lot of volunteers. Remember the folks that wanted to join, be Mars astronauts, and they were willing to take that risk of actually going one way, the one-way ticket to Mars, right?
Right.
Yeah.
The question for me is, why would you want to go to Mars? I mean, the atmosphere is crap. They got windstorms all the time. How cold is it there? Do we know?
Oh, my.
I got to know. We got the rover on there with the thermometers. It's got to tell us how cold it is.
Offhand, I mean, Mars might be a little bit better than the moon, because the moon is even worse because of the lack of an atmosphere, right? I mean, the Atkins Basin, where the water is on the south pole of Mars, where it doesn't see the sun, I think they're talking about minus 384 degrees Fahrenheit. And then, of course, the sun, when on the sun side, then it's just 250 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, paper.
It's that hot.
Oh, yes. It's.
Oh, God.
The Apollo astronauts really, I mean, they didn't want to put them out too long because they just didn't know how long they could take those environments, right? The Aldrin and Armstrong were only there for like 2.5 to 3 hours on the surface, because they just didn't know how terrible and remote, it would be.
Would you like to get off the planet?
Some days, yes. You bet.
But as a scientist and engineer, working with JPL your whole life, basically, and seeing these missions and seeing these spectacular achievements in space and on Mars and everywhere else, would you like to go and just get off Earth and just see what's out there?
I would love to. I would love to see the Earth from space. And these things that Captain Kirk recently did, right? They sent him up in that, and he told us about it was like death, right? He said about space. I looked out into deep space and it was like death. It's kind of scary, but in a way it's also cathartic, right? It is what it is on that part. But looking at the Earth would be marvelous. Be absolutely marvelous. It would be so, like you were saying, looking out, seeing the stars, seeing a dark sky sight. It's a different religious, in a sense, experience, right?
The spiritual experience.
Yes, spiritual.
Yeah, right.
Absolutely.
So you've worked at JPL for many, many years. 37 years, did you say?
Yeah.
37 years. Is it a hard job to get?
It's not easy. No, it's not easy. It's not impossible either. So, I'm putting you between two poles here. So how would you do it? First of all, get really interested in what JPL is doing. Get educated. Look into, like you did for this podcast. Do a lot of research online and find out what is JPL doing, and is this something that you see as your calling? Can you get jazzed about it? Is this something you could do day by day? That's the first thing, right? And if you really feel like, yes, the stuff you're doing here at JPL, you're exploring, you're getting into things we haven't seen before. We're doing science, we're doing engineering, we're trying to move the needle forward for humanity. If that's the thing that turns you on, by all means, take the next step, which would be make sure you have some basis of science or engineering, right? Maybe you want to study propulsion. Maybe you want to do telecommunications. There's many different aspects, right? What part of this are you going to bring to the table so that you can play with the other boys and girls at the table, right? What do I have to add? Yeah, there's a lot of smart people. You can be intimidated easily. But you know what? Everybody brings a unique quality. And if you care and if you are driven and you really want to make something of yourself, gosh, you know what happens, John. You do it.
Yeah.
You do it and you make it happen. And there's full of people. The other thing at JPL that's marvelous, that I will say, truly marvelous, you can move around. There's 5,000 to 6,000 people that work there. There's many different types of engineering that's being done. You can move from being a telecommunications engineer to a propulsion engineer. Yeah, that's a big step. That's a lot different. Yeah, that's a lot of different relearning. People do it. Why? Because they're jazzed about learning about something they didn't know before. And they definitely talk, and they learn about it, and they start getting hooked, and they start saying, I think I can contribute there. That's cool. Boy, you just learned a whole different trade.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And you didn't have to leave. You could leave. You can go off. You can work for Elon. You can work for all sorts of different people and come back.
That's great. And you get a $5 burger here at the cafeteria.
Well, yeah, and if you go to Goldstone, the tracking station, we're talking 1974 prices still. I mean, the cafeteria there is very small and more economical, but I'm telling you, their prices are almost out of this world.
Excellent. Greg Kazz, thank you for coming on my podcast. Thank you for being a great neighbor of mine for 20 plus years. But it's been great to really talk to you and present you and share you with the rest of the world because of their knowledge, and it's just so freaking cool.
Yeah, I hear you, and I truly appreciate and enjoy your friendship, and I'm so thankful that I've had the opportunity to spread the word. And my last word will be, hey, come out and join and see JPL, take a tour, and also open house, right? Every year we have open house, typically, sometimes not, but typically we do. And check it out. Check us out. Learn about it.
Thanks for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Alrighty, that wraps up another episode of Across the Dynaverse, talking about the universe. And a huge thank you to Caltech and JPL rocket systems engineer Greg Kazz for all the information about space exploration and how to become a rocket man yourself. Now, the JPL Public Services Office does offer a limited number of on-site in-person tours free of charge for groups and individuals on an advanced reservation basis. Just log on and visit jpl.nasa, that's NASA.gov. That's jpl.nasa.gov for all the details. If you're enjoying the podcasts and want to support my effort to host at least one episode from every state, visit my Patreon page at patreon.com/Dynaverse, and you can become a patron for as little as $3 a month, just like Lorraine McCreary did in Curtis, Nebraska. That's patreon.com/Dynaverse. Always searching for the heart and soul of America, one diner at a time. What's your story?